school in 2021. And this is our final one today. Just a reminder, like I said before, please have your cameras on and name yourself appropriately so we can match you up for your credits. Again, a reminder, this program is approved for professional engineer, land surveyor, and landscape architect credits. So without further ado, I am going to introduce our Master of Ceremonies for today, but also the person who came up with this whole series himself, Mr. David Thaler.
Well, thank you, Carrie, for that very kind introduction. And I want to talk today about one of my very favorite subjects. It's a bit, arcane, and that is stormwater management. I remember very clearly, my father was a builder, fairly successful after the Second World War. And I think I was in graduate school and he called me up one day and he said, "Son, we're done for. We're out of business." And I said, "Pop, what do you mean?" He says, we're finished. We have to do this thing called sediment control. And he was serious. He thought we were done. And next time I was home, I went out to see what was going on. And he had dug a hole about the size of 2 Olympic-size swimming pools. And that was sediment control in the day. And shortly thereafter, there was stormwater management. And believe it or not, we used to do in-stream stormwater management when we started. That is, we would throttle down the outfall of an existing stream. And then stormwater management moved on and we did detention facilities and then retention facilities. And then water quality came along. And in 2007, the legislature passed the Stormwater Management Act of 2007, and by about 2012, most of the Maryland jurisdictions had adopted the regulations to implement it. And the goal of the program was to maintain after development as near as possible pre-development runoff characteristics. And essentially, the design strategy that we were told to use was to replicate to the extent possible the natural hydrology. And so we've had, and the idea was ESD to the MEP, environmental site design to the maximum extent practicable. And so ESD has really been in place for land development projects for over a decade now. And like anything else, bugs have been developed. And what I want to talk about today is some of the real improvements that we really need to see in ESD. And our speaker today is an outstanding young engineer. He's very modest, but he's really one of the most brilliant engineers that I've ever met. He's a partner with Fred Ward and Associates in Bel Air. He has 12 years of professional engineering, construction administration, and construction management experience. And he has designed numerous planning studies, engineering designs, and for DOD, federal and state clients, along with many private sector site developments. He's an active member of the Society of American Military Engineers, the American Society of Civil Engineers, the Maryland Building Industry Association, and NIOP. And I can't tell you how pleased I am to have today our speaker. Please welcome Mr. Tom Miner. Tom, it's all yours.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the kind accolades. Some of them might be founded. So David asked that I put together a little slideshow to go over kind of my opinion, and I can get on my soapbox and talk about how I think ESD is and kind of the stormwater management, how it's progressed. And, I'm sure those of us who have been in, doing this for a number of years and longer than me have plenty of war stories and plenty of findings that they've found throughout their career. I guess while I'm going through this, if someone has any comments or wants to input or has, totally just disagrees with what I have to say, please throw it in the comments and maybe I'll adjust or just disagree with you accordingly. So without further ado, here I'm going to try and get my chat screen going here. There we go, just in case someone posts anything. All right, so ESD as it ought to be. Like I said, I'm going to be presenting, some of my opinions, and hopefully some other items that can help everyone work through the design, some ideas, some concepts, and hopefully this can end with a discussion of ways that maybe as an industry we can work or push our system and what we have to work with throughout the state of Maryland, how we can progress the design, progress the industry, and really work through how we can get the permit quicker, because typically this is a critical component in breaking ground, which then holds us up for the rest of the project. So kind of just go over a brief history. David kind of touched on it lightly for stormwater management. Early on, in the 80s, they started kind of going for quantity management, really with focusing on curve numbers, TR55. This was based on a very generalized areas, large drainage areas going to large facilities with a estimated curve number a lot of times. If you look at the old sites, you'll see industrial properties with assumed 85 curve numbers of an 85 or higher. These were very safe, very easy to assume numbers, and the good part is it allowed us to build out in the future without having to modify our facilities for later. Progressively, they found that our quantity wasn't the only thing. We had to worry about quality. Those quality calculations initially started with kind of a ½ inch of water quality over in the early 90s over the impervious area, and then we progressed into 1 inch of water quality over the impervious area. Later on in the 90s and early 2000s, the water quality is very different kind of than what we are not. Well, it's fairly different than what we see today. They're extended detention basins, low flow drawdown pipes, wet ponds. Thermal impacts weren't a concern then, like they are now for different use streams. So the designs were very, 1-2 facilities kind of met the intent, and we could localize it in a low point and kind of move on. It became, it was while not super onerous, it was a task, but it wasn't kind of the way we see stormwater is nowadays. Some municipalities are still working in this level of detail. We were just going over a project in West Virginia where they said 1 inch over the entire area. I think that's Morgantown. So some are still working in this more simplified method, which has its pluses and minuses, generally more pluses because you're not becoming an accountant. But in Maryland, we're getting pushed more into a much more complicated variation than what we've had to deal with, in the past few decades. The good parts about this were, the calculations were large scale, they were quick, they were relatively easy. We could have assumed areas because we were kind of just generalizing the entire mass of the property or the mass of the drainage area. And they generally tend to be very conservative. We have projects that are historically that we're redelineating and doing further development on nowadays. Our quantity managements are typically already met because they were so over designed back when they were initially done back in the 80s, 90s, and even early 2000s. Versus nowadays, when you're looking at quantity designs and quality designs, they're so micro analyzed that sometimes minor increases of impervious and changes of hydrology on a site can result in various changes in the topography and hydrology of the site. The bad parts about that, though, is they really didn't touch on the extent of nitrogen, phosphorus, total suspended solids removals. The groundwater recharge in the area was really focused in one location, so we weren't getting a good spread and treatment of your groundwater percolating back in the ground, particularly for residential sites that may be needing groundwater recharge for wells and things like that. There were definitely some benefits to it, but it wasn't mimicking true hydrology. Knowing how these were developed and older projects, how they developed these calculations can help us particularly work in the current system, so that then we're not over designing our site now if we know that we have available quantity in these ponds, or there was additional water quality that was available and the county or municipality lets you get some credit for that. You might be able to undertreat that ESD that's now required because we're already providing additional management. So brief run through of what ESD is. I think a lot of us on here are already familiar with kind of what it amounts to. The definition by MDE is a comprehensive design strategy for maintaining pre-development runoff characteristics, protecting natural resources. ESD is using small-scale stormwater management practices, non-structural techniques, and better site planning to mimic natural hydrology, runoff characteristics, and minimize the impact of land development on water resources. That sounds really great, but this statement lumps in a lot of things that we're not able to change about our site. If a developer wants to put a giant warehouse on the site, we're not going to be able to have infiltration on your 1 million square foot Amazon big box. We're going to be paving it. There's not much you can do about it. And then land development, mimicking runoff characteristics with non-structural techniques. Certain things in zoning codes are requiring us to have a certain amount of parking, even if we want to have less parking. We're required to do certain things, and the 2000 manual focuses on changing their zoning code requirements, but there was no teeth to force the counties to do that. So we've really been given an intent without any type of change in our local codes to actually change our site design to reduce the amount of parking, reduce the amount of roads that we need, or the width of the roads typically. The concept of having the impervious continue to be treated was carried through, similar to the early 90s and 2000 concept of water quality. So a lot of our treatment is based on capturing impervious runoff with a focus on dispersing it throughout the system. The kind of big thing to keep remembering as we go through all of these rules is that the whole intent is to return your site to woods in good condition for a 1-year event. So we can get lost in the 2000 manual, all the different nuances, but at the end of the day, this is still a volumetric concept to reduce your discharge of your 1-year event with what we're providing on the site, or what we're generating over the site. ESD to the maximum extent practical. There's a lot of discussion, and a lot of different interpretations. Is the 1 inch the minimum, and then is the PE that's generated the goal, and you have to provide proof that you can't meet the ESDV goal before you can go with anything else. Some municipalities take that as the approach. Other municipalities find that 1 inch is the goal for ESD, and if you provide more than that, that's great, but you don't have to provide it in ESD. BMPs, are for different facilities and treatment. We start with chapter 5, which is what we have to provide at least for the 1 inch. And then we go to an ESDV, our total volume later on is being, a lot of counties want you to provide chapter 5 facilities, which is your micro facilities, in and treating the full volume. If you can't meet that, then you have to go to a chapter 3 facility, which is like a large pond, a wet pond, a pocket pond, some type of still water quality filtering device that you would see in the early 90s, late 90s, and early 2000s. If you can't meet, after that, then we would have to be going to more of a structural feature, which could be a detention basin or an underground vault. Components, prior components were, you had quantity, which would be, your 2-year, your 10-year, your 100-year, and then it went to a water quality aspect, which was really nowadays is considered more as a channel protection volume with less actual filtering devices. Nowadays we have, we have groundwater recharge, we have water quality, we have CPV, which are all part of ESD volume. You can, depending on the county, separate this ESD volume into groundwater recharge, water quality, and CPV. If you're not meeting all of those, it becomes a little more complicated, but depending on the site usage, it might be necessary to split them all up. And again, that kind of goes into how the county views ESD. If they think it's a mandate from MDE and they have no flexibility, then they're going to say you got to stick with ESD. If they find that it's more of a intent-driven code, then they might let you split it up a little bit more. The quantity is pretty much completely locally controlled, depending on their codes and regs. MDE won't touch that. They won't regulate that. They defer to the county on how quantity management is obtained and how it needs to be treated, and if there even needs to be quantity management. Some locations, particularly Eastern Shore, only require a Q2 quantity management. And ESD typically can treat a lot of that versus other municipalities. Harford County requires a Q10 no matter where you're located. And then Baltimore County requires a Q10 sometimes, Q100 sometimes. It depends on which watershed you're in. So the municipality gets to pick and choose, and it's important to be aware of what requirements each location has. Going into the complexity, I'm sure a lot of you have already done a site evaluation to understand what the calculations are required for figuring out what your ESD is for a site. There's a lot more components than there used to be. You have various study points. You have, you typically had your soil types, but your study points are now, more focused on localized points of discharge. Your existing and proposed impervious are the same, but again, you're now, because you're trying to focus it on individual smaller facilities, you're not taking that kind of approximation of amount of impervious or curve number. You're taking a very specific number, a specific area that you're having to treat, because every square foot of impervious is costing you that much more to treat. You got to include your limited disturbance. If that changes, then you got to change all your calculations, and that progresses through your report, progresses through your plan sheets, and it just results in a lot more accounting. The key calculation is ESDV is your PE value, which is determined based on your impervious area. Your RV, which is your impervious area times this basically dimensionless coefficient, and then your total area, which is in square feet. This changes. There's a couple different ways counties will recognize how you're treating it. A lot of times you'll take your PEs and then take the weighted averages of various the soil groups. Other times they'll say, I've had them where they say whatever the highest PE is for that area, take that based on the highest percent impervious. They've tackled it differently, and they've, counties, as they understand the rules, have modified their clarifications. MDE has been releasing clarifications. They can't release, I guess I can get into this later, but they can't release a modification to the 2000 manual because it's written into COMAR, but they do release clarifications to try to kind of get around the fact that they can't modify the 2000 manual as it currently stands. Computations are much more precise at the end of the day. Where it takes a lot more time to obtain the data. We can do quick approximations, but at the end of the day, when we need to do an exact site fingerprint of the ESD, it definitely takes more time than it used to in the prior delineations and prior computations that we used to work with. Similarly, the timing wise, we have to go through, we're required to go through a 3-step process unless the county waives, sometimes the county will waive the site requirement if it's a small project, but typically required to provide a concept, a site, and a final. And they say, oh, it's a 3-step process, which is not necessarily really the case. There's a concept, site, and a final. Then there's also a submission for, depending on how the county works it, there's a bonding and approval set and submission. So after they give you final approval, you then have to submit for bonding and signatures, and then Mylar and recordation of the plans. And then after all of that, you then have to go to a pre-construction meeting. So if you're, getting a concept approval, then you go to site, and then you go to final. If they give you final approval, depending on how the municipality works, you still might be 2 months away from being able to break ground. So, a lot of times developers are going, we've gotten final approval, what's going on? And you're like, well, we still got to go through all this other paperwork before we can actually even still break ground for a permit, because after final, you're now coordinating with the sediment control inspectors. You're getting bonding and paperwork in order, your various agreements. Some groups will allow you to submit that with this final, but a lot of times they'll want that afterwards when you're submitting the final Mylar set or the recorded set for signature, which is sometimes are not part of the final process. Versus, in the past, it used to be you would just submit your documents, then they turn around, provide comments, and kind of go through the sets of reviews a number of times as necessary to get the documents to approval. In my opinion, this kind of just makes it a much longer process. It's kind of more well defined, but the process definitely just gets extended out because we have to check these boxes, and the municipality typically won't review quantity management in concept. So they only review ESD, and then they're only looking at quantity when it gets to site. Well, sometimes that's an issue because you've provided your ESD and they're only roughly reviewing to make sure you have enough space for your quantity management, which then runs into an issue at site, and then they might need another review at site, and then you submit it for final, and then they might need another review for final. So it doesn't really come to be a 3-step process. It can be multiple submissions for each one of these steps, depending on the series of comments you get. And here's just their flow chart of how they kind of envisioned it to go. As you can see, there's a couple circles, which you can kind of get lost in as you go through the process. Interpretation, intent, and then communication. I think a lot of times this particularly gets, there gets to be some confusion, and or the reviewing agency, I'll say, for lack of a better term, blames MDE for their interpretations. The manual defines ESD as the maximum extent practical. It defines what Chapter 5 facilities and 3 facilities are, and what's acceptable. And then it defines all these components. The definition of what they are is fairly clear. The question is how does MDE, the review agency that reviews the MS4 permits that each county has, or town or government entity has these different permits for providing the review and compliance. These, MDE is going to be reviewing them based on the manual, and I found that they typically give a fairly lax review of the items. They're not, as long as you have justification and proof of why you're doing something. I've never really seen there's a lot of variation between counties. So my take is if you have a lot of variation between counties, that means that, and the only commonality is the MDE, that means MDE is allowing that variation to occur. So it really comes down to the county's definition of what is ESD to them and how do they want to function in this manual to allow for treatment of runoff to the bay. A lot of times counties have facility preferences, whether it would be Baltimore County where they kind of are okay with, Baltimore County, Baltimore City, they're okay with you have multiple microbioretentions. You can kind of potentially lump them together into one bioretention if necessary, because they don't see the point of providing a single berm through what should be one bioretention facility. Calculations, Cecil County allows you to do some different things with your volumetric calculations for your submerged gravel wetlands, with based the way they interpret how the facility stores the volume. And then, what's the intent? Does the county think that ESD to the MEP means ESD to the full rain event, or does it mean ESD to the 1 inch event? So it really comes down to what they think their instructions are for a site or for their MS4 permit. And then they also have the kind of outliers, which is compliance with the county code, because there are certain aspects in each county that has stormwater management involved that kind of can throw you little curves, because a lot of times, you can go through the county code and sometimes it applies, sometimes it doesn't apply to your project. And sometimes the interpretation of how that county code is written is going to change depending on the unit, what the county exec that's in there. Does he want to have a more, or do they want to have a more restrictive kind of viewpoint of the county code, or are they more compliant with looking for development? And then once you get past the county aspect of it and their interpretation, then you're going to be getting into your own reviewer. How experienced is the reviewer? Do they know what they're looking at, or are they kind of just trying to check the boxes off? Have they seen a lot of things? They have a lot of scars that they've been burnt on in the past, and therefore they're either more hesitant to approve things, or have they seen enough to where they know it's going to work out. Really getting down in the weeds with the reviewer is one of the most important things of this. Having a good relationship with them, or at least having them trust your engineering expertise is kind of critical. Otherwise, they're going to just keep raking you over the coals with multiple comments, things that might not be right, but then you kind of have to go to either the county, the reviewer's boss, or MDE for clarification to then have them fall in line. So understanding how this reviewer defines things is very critical. And then you have a designer's experience for different products. There's a lot of different options you can go out there and design to, and understanding where those products and those design options are good choices and where they don't fit appropriately are important. And then we have, the designers just, providing the developer's intent. And so there's a big line of, I'd try to say the telephone game, to try to match something that is, getting to be less science and less mathematical and more intent driven, which can cause issues, because, if we're pulling away from the math so much and we're trying to interpret a few 100-page book, it gets to be much more, relationship based, communication based, and less math based, and less engineering judgment based. Kind of hit on this a little bit. Stormwater Management Act, that was done in 2007, references the 2000 manual, and it's written in the COMAR, so it really gives very limited flexibility with MDE to revise things they found that don't really work as well. So they try to release clarifications, and those clarifications, they're trying to work within the current rules. They keep wanting to do updates, but it takes a little bit of political will to update a manual and to go through the rules and regs and revise those. And then additionally, things to consider outside of all of ESD is really just how that integrates in with all the other permits and regulations we have to incorporate when it comes to stormwater, whether it be wetlands integration, buffers for floodplains, that are state and federal, and then local requirements. How does each county view these natural resources do they want to protect them at all costs? Do they really need to see anything, or is this something that they just need to check a box off that you show steep slopes, or check a box off that there's might be bedrock showing in one location, or are you going to have to do a full report to show them that X, Y, and Z is okay? So that's something that's in the manual, so the counties and the states have to adhere to it. And then, the one thing that is always interesting to me is that they have certain italicized areas in the book, and those are non-negotiable items to the county versus things that aren't italicized or just regular text. They are able to be worked through potentially, depending on the willpower of the county to be, let the engineer design according to their needs. So the manual gave us a bunch of different alternatives. We have alternative surfaces, non-structural practices, microscale practices, but then they give a summary of site development strategies, which have very little to do with what we can do on our site, because this is really zoning code, or various codes, or site driven designs that we can't really modify. A 33-foot turning radius, I believe, a lot of streets, narrower streets, we can't change that, and the county's not going to change the roadway code and various rules to meet these requirements. So some of these things, when you read them, you're like, okay, great, they obviously didn't think through some of this design, because they're putting it in the manual as like, this is how you're going to meet these practices and design accordingly, but it had nothing to do with stormwater management. It really just had to do with zoning requirements and site layout, which we have very, depending on the type of use, we have limited flexibility in. So going through just a quick, I know a lot of people are probably very familiar with the type of uses for this, but there's a bunch of different a lot of different types of practices, and I found that all these practices, they fit for a particular use. And when I get into a site, I see what the site is, and then, okay, I can use that application in this location. I can use this application in this location, really with the focus, initially of cost, but then not just cost, but then how it encumbers the property later. And then the kind of maintenance costs that someone's going to have to bear later with that as well. So your maintenance, your cost to construct, and then how it impacts someone's property after that. I mean, if we provide a green roof, it might be great, and the client might even be willing to build it if they're selling the product at the end. But is the homeowner going to want to maintain a flat roof that they have to get up on there and mow every other week? I know I wouldn't. So, green roofs, if you have a client that wants to do that, that's great. I would probably charge them a higher fee, just because if they're willing to spend that money on a green roof, they probably have extra money to spend elsewhere. It becomes a semi-impractical item. It requires a lot of structural design components to support all the additional weight. They only treat themselves, so it's an extremely expensive way to provide self-treatment. It looks cool, but it's definitely one of the it's the most expensive way you can provide very little treatment for a site. But if it's something that increases the marketability of a site, maybe it's worthwhile. Permeable pavement has its places, particularly, if you want to have a nice patio, you can make, if you're going to do pavers anyway, you can always do permeable paver patios, and those will be nice. They'll provide their own treatment. They're a little more expensive than standard patios, but it might be the best way to kind of tackle your project. The permeable concrete is okay. It can have a decent lifespan, but has a tendency to ravel, and really is the applications I've seen them in, I've always found that I'm like, well, we probably could have gotten away with something better that didn't cost as much and didn't cause long-term maintenance issues. Because once this starts raveling up and turning into gravel again, you got to tear the whole thing out, which is a huge cost. Reinforced turf is definitely a more applicable need for certain sites, particularly areas where, churches, where you have overflow parking lots and the zoning code allows allows you to have overflow parking where you're only going to need it once a week or once every few months, for traversing a site, and you don't want it to get all rutted up. So I've used that frequently, and it's a good product. It's not terribly expensive, and it's cheaper than a parking lot. So you get your permeable surface, and you don't have to build a parking lot if you are allowed to by zoning code. Provide parking, your overflow parking, or your if you don't need as much daily parking, but you still need it in peak conditions. Other items, particularly rooftop disconnects. The non-structural practices are great, but they do take up a lot of room for disconnection of runoff, and you only get 1 inch of treatment. So in these municipalities that require greater than 1 inch for your ESD, full ESD treatment, this only gets you partially there. So there's definitely depending on the municipality's interpretation, this can be a limiting application. However, the more lenient municipalities, this can be a great way to just not even have to install a facility. Problem could potentially be for non-rooftop disconnections and sheet flow to conservation is you are encumbering that area that's supposed to be lawn. You're encumbering that so that you can't build anything there in the future. If you have to build something there, then you got to do a whole nother stormwater management practice to then mitigate for what you're losing when it comes to your disconnections. But they're all very cheap as long as you have the land. The biggest difference, kind of between non-rooftop disconnection and sheet flow to conservation is in the pathways, for paths, and this is a path we did in Hartford County. It was convenient because we didn't have slopes less than 5% in some areas, and we just had to put in a level spreader downstream of the path here, which was just some 57 stone, and then we could have that sheet flow off into the woods, which was going to stay woods perpetually. So it was basically a free alternative when we were building our path to get credit for it. But all these practices are really good when you have a lot of space. They start to really fall apart as soon as you get into more dense urban type settings or where land values are very high. Microscale practices. This is kind of the bread and butter for a lot of ESD. Rainwater harvesting is very rarely used. I feel like it's quite hard. I think particularly in Maryland to need to harvest. We're not in an arid environment, so typically we don't need to water a lot of our plants excessively unless maybe we're at a golf course. So to spend the money for rainwater harvesting for watering doesn't make much sense. And then there's really not, when you look at purple water reuse for sewage, there's just not a lot of the amount of demand for a facility's purple water versus the amount of runoff you obtain during a rainwater harvesting event is very minimal, and you're having to put in tanks and pumps and everything else. So there's occasional use where it's applicable in high urban settings and things, but it's fairly rare unless you have a particular want or need for it. Submerged gravel wetlands, typically, this is my go-to if we have poorly drained soils. Some municipalities are resistant to its use because they think that it violates the spirit of ESD. But it is probably the cheapest and most efficient way to treat a bunch of runoff with ESD, and the benefits, you have less facilities, you can kind of concentrate your flows. Typically it's in a low point of the site where the soils aren't great. So it's really beneficial. What you typically have to do is you provide your submerged gravel wetlands, then you throw a microbiome retention somewhere else on the site to show that you're meeting ESD, at least in spirit. Landscape infiltration. This is very similar to rain gardens, but they're small little depressions in the ground that you're kind of planting. They can also be planter boxes. I've used those as well, calling those landscape infiltration facilities. So there's some flexibility there. I kind of feel like MDE ran out of things, and they had one called landscape infiltration and one called rain gardens, and kind of called them the same, kind of made them the same thing. for treatment purposes. They just need more items to, I think, put in the book. Infiltration berms, those are kind of interesting. They have somewhat limitations though, because you have to be laying the berms on a flat grade and they have to follow the contours of the site. And you know, they end up being very long linear features that kind of encumber a certain section. I've used them very infrequently. They have occasional use, but I found that there's other, you know, swales and other things that can provide more treatment and kind of accomplish the goal. Dry wells are great for hiding, you know, a facility underground for houses in particular, so someone doesn't have to worry about them or maintain them really. Runoff goes into them and just becomes a giant, you know, seepage pit to allow infiltration again. Microbios, it's the typical facility everyone uses, really common. You can do a couple different things with them. They can become somewhat structural with similar to like a Filterra. You can put them in boxes. I'd say, you know, this is the 80% of the facilities are microbios or something like that, or somewhere in that swale bioretention, bioswale type layout where you're putting a filter media in, you're putting an under drain or letting it infiltrate into the ground, and then having small drainage areas to each one of these. Rain gardens are very similar to them, except that they don't have under drains and they're usually a little bit easier and quicker to put, or easier and cheaper to put in. But they do have the limitation of you want to have decent infiltration for a rain garden. So type A and B soils. Enhanced filters, well, I guess swales, they're great for linear features, roadways, paths, things like that. I like to put a swale, you know, if we need to have a bypass swale or we need to have a swale on the site to catch runoff to send it somewhere else, it's a good way just to widen it out a little bit and provide some stormwater management, even for free. If you need a swale anyway to, you know, shift it around a house or a roadway or something like that. Bioswales can kind of do the same thing, just get a little more bank or a little more treatment, but they do take a little more time to construct. You're having to put special under drains in and media, so something just to be aware of. I'm gonna try to move a little quicker through this when out of time. Enhanced filters, those are basically just underground stone vaults or underground stone underneath some microbios or rain gardens. And then everyone's seen various filter cartridges, Filterras, and things like that. They're good alternatives, but they usually are required in redevelopment sites or very urban settings where you don't really have other alternatives. All right, going through real quick here. There's a lot of interpretation differences in various municipalities. This is just a list of ones that I kind of have. So when I sit down in a new location or with a reviewer I haven't really talked with before, I can talk with them kind of what their thoughts are and their intent. So then we can, you know, really design the site accordingly. You know, some of these is ESD going to be required for the full site or just for the 1 inch of the event? And then what is maximum extent practical? What is reasonable to them? You know, ESDV versus ESDB and IART. State and federal projects have an IART requirement. So that's just saying impervious area requiring treatment. So you have to treat all of the impervious area or show why you can't treat it all. That becomes very difficult and sometimes impractical. And so there's a lot of effort that gets put into that. And then I'm going to just kind of go through these really, you know, hydrology. Are they going to be really picky about the hydrology of the site? Do you want to be reviewing that with them initially so that then you get their buy-in, so you're not having to redo all your calculations? You know, there's just a number of different ones, and you'll kind of find that as you go through different municipalities, they all interpret everything as just different enough to throw you occasionally. So it's good to have a list of questions kind of assembled before you go into there, knowing what are the common trip-ups. So with the ESD regulations being intent-driven, I always find it's really good to have a concept of how I want to manage the site very early on, present that to the reviewers in the municipality, try to get all the questions ironed out. Sometimes the meeting can last a little bit because you're kind of poking at if you haven't worked with them a lot before, you're poking at various weeds questions that can potentially trip you up, but you kind of are during that conversation. I find that you're kind of getting what they think the intent of ESD is. So you're kind of getting a flavor of what that reviewer or that jurisdiction feels is their responsibility to review. And then when you're doing your layouts, considering the cost, land utilization, approval times, all these different items, should be considered when you're citing your facilities, along with what the site actually needs to be done, what needs to be done on the site to accomplish the developer's goals. Because at the end of the day, stormwater management is something that's in the way of development effectively, and it's not an ends to it's an ends to a means. It's not the goal in and of itself. Let's see, we got 1250. I'll go through these real quick. So this site here, this was a state of Maryland, state and federal project. So this is where we have IART involved. So we have, we had to capture almost all of our impervious area, and we had tons of microbios. We have 13 microbios, a submerged gravel wetland over here, a lot of facilities to meet the requirement to capture all of the impervious on this site. Conversely, this is a project that has 100 acres of disturbance. So this was 9 acres. This project had 100 acres. The reviewers were okay with having submerged gravel wetlands because of the poor soils in a few areas, and really discharging those to non-378 ponds that were very shallow to then discharge out to the streams. This basically allowed us to make the site very efficient cost-wise, but then also to avoid going through a 378 pond review, increasing our review and then approval times. This is, the design here was something of the reviewer, or the project. This was an earlier project when ESD was kind of new, but I'd say the mentality in this municipality hasn't really changed so much, in that they opted to force ESD fully, and they allowed a bunch of bioretentions on the homeowners' parcels to manage runoff on the county roadways. And so this was something that was new. They don't really allow this anymore, but it was still allowed. So, and this is something that happens. I think this happens mainly because the county isn't responsible for the maintenance of these facilities. They're always put in HOAs here, and they don't have to be concerned about the functionality of the life cycle. They just say, look, if it's not working, we'll just lean and find the HOA. So how much the county has ownership in these facilities makes a big difference on how they review. But also, this layout would be it was extremely expensive to construct a bunch of individual microbios and associated dry wells. I mean, there's probably 60 microbios on this site and probably 200 dry wells. It's a very expensive design. Conversely, this site here has, in another municipality, has some submerged gravel wetlands. It has detention basins for managing your CPV, since we're only managing the 1 inch in the submerged gravel wetlands. They allowed us to manage the additional ESD volume or CPV volume above the 1 inch in these detention facilities. So we have slow release, detention ponds. This, the cost differential between setting up a lot here and setting up a lot for this site is, one might be $5,000 of stormwater management, a lot. The other one, this one's probably closer to like 25 or more. So the design matters substantially, particularly in these large lots. And this is kind of an example. This was part of that development, and this was the next phase of that development, where the design did not include these microbios in every single one, and the facilities were put in the rear here in HOA land. So they were more concentrated, and we were able to, accomplish treating individual lots for their impervious, but then the roadways were then sent off behind the facility to then manage itself. off the individual homeowner site, therefore not burdening them with with management. This is just kind of a common example of management on a single lot basis with a disconnection here and then dry wells located behind the house, treating the actual rooftop runoff. And then this one's another, same type of, I guess, project in a way, with two different approaches. They're both very urban, dense projects where we're doing pretty much all structural, in a way, stormwater management. With this project meeting ESD fully, even though it's redevelopment, we're being required to provide full ESD. And these are microbios in basically concrete planter boxes, very large concrete, planter boxes. They're going to be called microbios, with an underground detention vault in the underground parking area. This was a condominium building. This apartment complex, we have a filtera, an underground sand filter, and then an underground stormwater vault. So the cost differential for this, they're both going to be expensive, but the cost differential to install this one versus a bunch of planter beds is going to be, because these are all cast in place planter boxes that are going to have to be specially made, versus these, which can be kind of set and precast offsite. But just very different. They were allowing sand filters and proprietary filteras, versus this location they were requiring microbios, because that's what they're familiar with and that's their preference. So they are always this location is more resistant to approving different, more unique designs. All right, my opinion on to summarize it up: county regulations and reviewers and subjective nature of the intent is driving our designs, and consistency with all of these components is going to be very unlikely. So the best way we can kind of solve that is to have a better line of communication with the reviewers, with the municipalities, and then also have the reviewers and municipalities trust the engineer more so than I feel like they typically do in most cases. Kind of the urban places urban locations are usually a little more hesitant to trust the engineer, and they try to rely more on code and in their interpretation, so that then they can be at least consistent throughout their municipality. Versus more rural areas, they prefer to, I find that they are more logical, and are not that the other ones aren't logical, but they generally tend to let the engineer do what they think is best. So ways to improve that is to really get have the municipalities respect the engineer, and unless there's a complete violation of the interpretation, to side more with the signing and sealing design engineer than to tell the engineer what they think their interpretation of a piece of code is. Municipalities, I really think they need to recognize the approximation of what we're doing on these sites. Stormwater management is a general approximation. As long as we're generally meeting the requirements, they should really be embracing more the approximation of this whole aspect of design, rather than thinking that it's something much more precise, similar to like a structural engineer. The focus on functionality and maintenance. Some municipalities focus on just meeting ESD without really understanding that, if these things fail in 10, 15 years, it's going to hurt the bay in the long run. It's not going to help. So meeting these requirements for the sake of meeting them without the intent of long-term survivability is, short-sighted. And then, on understanding that, these codes and regulations are costing a lot of effort, a lot of money, a lot of time, and then trying to work through that with the reviewer is going to be, I think that's something we should be really pushing, and having them understand that cost is a factor, even though they technically can't change their design. They can't have comments based purely upon cost. Being cognizant of it is, at least something, rather than just totally ignoring it. And then facility design and flexibility. When we can't get some things to work, them recognizing that the requirements are flexible and have allowances for meeting the intent. That's it. Looks like I'm 2 minutes.
Tom, that was absolutely fantastic. What a great analysis of ESD and stormwater management. I would just like to re-emphasize a point you just made, and that really is the approximate nature of really everything that we're doing. We come out with plans that are to the 100th of a foot, and yet we really forget that our input data is rainfall data, which if it's plus or minus 50%, would probably be a good level of accuracy. And you can't be plus or minus 50% going in and to the hundredths of a foot coming out. So I thought that was an excellent point that you made. Carrie, do we have any questions in the chat box? And we have a studio audience here. Do we have any questions here? John? Any questions?
We don't see any, David. I mean, that was so thorough.
Okay, anybody here? John Motzko has a question. Go ahead.
So in Baltimore County, we've been using submerged gravel wetlands predominantly for single-family residential. And I'm just curious what jurisdictions have been, I guess, reluctant to approve the use of the submerged gravel wetland.
Well, I don't know if you can hear that. The question is, the go-to design is submerged gravel wetlands because that really doesn't have much of a drainage area restriction. That's what we really like to use. Tom, what jurisdictions are reluctant to use submerged gravel wetlands?
So
and why?
So the why is typically because they see a couple of statements by MDE going, it shouldn't be solely used as the means of treatment for ESD. And so they take that and go, well, if it shouldn't be solely used, we should avoid using it whenever possible. And if you propose a submerged gravel wetland, you got to prove to us why that is the only option you can use. So it's basically ESD to the MEP. And if you use a submerged gravel wetland, you have to also justify why you can't do something else. So that's what they're, let's put it this way. So I wasn't going to name counties, but Hartford County is very much like that. You have to prove to you why you can't do a submerged gravel wetland. They are, they've been very resistant. They'll allow it, but you've always got to kind of come back and prove why you have to do it. Cecil County, a lot of these projects, for this site, this is Cecil County. They said, yeah, do a submerged gravel wetland. It's a giant parking lot for 77 acres, and just do the 1 inch, and then just do CPV after that. So you have two locations that are right next to each other that have completely diametrically opposed viewpoints on how we should be managing it. And MDE neither supports nor they in conversations with them, I found that they really are like, it's up to the county. So you have the same code, the same book, and they're applying themselves completely different. I mean, like I was saying with this site versus this site, there's you're talking, I mean, I said 25,000. I can't imagine. It probably is more than that. It's probably closer to like $35,000 per lot versus something like this that ignoring the storm drains probably are closer to 5,000, if that. So it really comes down to the reviewers or that stormwater management group, how they view their edict from MDE should be performed and reviewed. So
great. Carrie, any more questions do we have?
No, sir.
Tom, that was absolutely a terrific, very educational, wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. I want to thank everybody for listening in, particularly our loyal customers who stayed for the whole course. And today we come to the conclusion of the 2021 land development program. The continuing education certificates, as always, will go out in the next day or so. I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and I will hope we will see you in 2022. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you, guys.
Goodbye.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom.